This lecture covers macro variables. It's meant, again, to introduce you to the subject. If you go back to the advanced prep guide, you'll get a much more thorough treatment. Macros are used for a number of reasons. The kind of the underlying reason why you have a macro is if you have to do the same thing many times over, you want to use a macro. So rather than repeating a chunk of code many times, what macros are going to enable you to do is to put some codes in there so that you only write it once, but then it executes the many times that you need it. So there are a couple types of macro features in SAS. So the most basic is what I'll call a macro variable. Then we're going to talk a little bit about macro functions. We're going to talk about percent including other files, and we'll talk a little bit about options. So a few words about macros. Whenever you see a percent sign, that indicates that it's a macro command rather than a SAS command. So percent let is a macro command. The other special character that you're going to see all over the place is the ampersand. So ampersands also indicate macros. Let's start by talking a little bit about variables. So what the percent let command does is it assigns some value to a variable. So if I said percent let RFM equal, then these three variables, what's going to happen is that the variable RFM is going to be associated with everything between the equal sign and the semicolon. So the semicolon ends the macro command. Now, if later on in my program I wanted to compute the means of these three variables, what I would do then is invoke the macro. So ampersand RFM says replace ampersand RFM with whatever the value of that macro is. So this command would then map directly to these three variables. We'll talk about functions and include statements in a minute. A couple notes on macros. There are some options that you may want to use. So if you say options mprint, that's going to display additional information to the log about what the macro has done. mlogic and mtrace are also very useful in debugging macros if you have issues with them. Let me start with a very one of the most commonly used applications of macros that I encounter. Let's go back to the RFM data set. So this was from a previous assignment that you had. We're using that data set from the DMEF1 nonprofit. So here was our data set to create an RFM data set. So the program to create the RFM data set. What you're going to see is a lot of repetition in here. So first off, I'm making some new variables, recency, frequency, then we had frequency for solicitations A and D, and then monetary, which I called tote dollars. So we have these 5 variables, and the first thing we want to do is declare them and say, give them a length of 4 bytes. Then we have the exact same 4 variables, and we're going to say retain them. Then we come down and we're going to initialize the same, actually 5 variables. So we initialize them, and then we do some stuff to them. Then, if it's the last record, we output it. Then we have a keep statement. And that keep statement has the customer ID along with these 5 variables that we just created. Now, let's say that we wanted to add a variable. So if we wanted to count the frequency for solicitations of type B, well, what would I have to do? I'd have to type it here, then I'd have to type freak B here, I'd have to put a freak B here, have to put something here, and then put it in the keep statement. And chances are I'm going to forget to put it in one of those places. So this would be a great application of a macro. let me show you some better code. So what I would recommend doing is having a macro variable, %let, and I always use the macro variable new var for new variables. You can call it x, you can call it whatever you like. And I list those 5 variables that I'm creating. And then notice I invoke that macro wherever I need it. Now I've done one other thing. I've put these into an array so that everything gets initialized to 0, then I have an additional statement down here for recency. So if it's the first record for recency, we set it equal to missing. I suppose I could have made this slightly more efficient by just assigning it the diff value, or the date value in this case, but I didn't think of that. All right, so now if I wanted to add some new variables, I would just list them up here. So freak B, freak C, if I want to create monetary by solicitation type, I could list all those, and it would all, it would get entered in all the right places. Of course, I'd have to have some other if-thens for freak B and freak whatever, but you see the point. Let me give you another use of macro variables that I often encounter. So when I'm dealing with surveys, the surveys will often have questions that go together. Now we've already seen an example of this with the CPK data set. So remember, question 6 was really composed of about 5 questions about the different aspects of your satisfaction with the food. Question 7 had 4 questions all about your satisfaction with service. And you tend to analyze these questions together. So you'll often want to run a factor analysis on them. So what I'll do is I'll create a file called vars.mac, and it's just going to define all these variables at a higher level. So I'm going to say Q6 is equal to all these questions from the CPK survey. Q7 is all these variables. Then I %include this file with all my macros in it. So if I say %include vars.mac, what that does is it goes out to the disk and brings in all this stuff that was in that file and makes them available to me. So if I wanted to factor analyze everything, then I would just do this. Now you're probably wondering, why stick this in a separate file? Why not just drop it in the file itself? If you're only going to use it once, it would make complete sense to put all of these commands right at the top of your program and be done with it. However, it's often the case that you don't use these things just once. So you're going to use them in multiple programs. So if I have multiple programs that are all referencing these variables, I'll just have that %include in every program, and it's very efficient that way. Another thing about this is, occasionally you make mistakes, or occasionally you want to add you make some change to this. With the %include business, you're going to change it once rather than having to go into every program and change it. Right? Another thing that I might do is form a super macro. Let's call it SAT, which includes all the satisfaction questions. What is this? Well, I'm going to invoke the 3 macros, so Q6, Q7, and Q8. And so SAT is going to be defined as all of these variables, Q6A, Q7A, Q8, all the way through Q8D. And then I can invoke that with proc factor var ampersand SAT. So that's another example. Here's now I'd like to move on and describe to you a little bit about macro functions. So macro variables just assign some value to a variable that gets, think of it as a search and replace. With a macro function, you're going to define a function that you can call up from any program that you have. So I have a number of macro functions that I use all the time, and here they are. So one of them is, I call it DSR, So DSR stands for Data Sufficiency Report. And whenever I read in a data set, I call up this macro. So let's talk about what this thing does. So first off, percent macro DSR, and then DSR is going to, it's like I'm defining a function, a new function of my own. This function is going to take two arguments. First is a data set name. Second is a set of frequency variables. So, for example, I might call this up with a data set that I just read in, and I would pass dat to it, and then I would list all the frequency variables. Now let's see what happens. First thing I do is I'm going to assign the title. So the title is going to be the data set name. So we insert whatever dat is. Then I'm going to run proc contents on it. I'm going to run proc means on it. And then I'm going to run frequencies on all of the freq variables. Now I've done one more thing here. I've got a little test. So if the length of the freq variables is greater than 0, so if I don't list any frequency variables, I'm not going to do this piece. Then we're going to do everything until end. So what's in there? Well, there's a proc freq, and I only want to run frequencies on the freq variables. Then I want to print the first 10 observations and say %mend. %mend ends the definition of the macro. Now I have a number of these. I put all of these, this is my hardened account. I have a special folder called bin. And bin has a whole lot of things that I use very often. Now one of these is this thing that I just showed you, DSR. And so this is exactly what I showed you. Now let's go over to my loyalty1 directory. And let's just go look at my read.dat.sass. So read.dat.sass is what I always call my program that reads in my data sets. And so if we look at this program, you'll see that the very first thing that I do is I %include that macro. So $home bin dsr.sass. And then I go read in some data sets and I call it. Looks like I commented some of these out, but here we go. So when I didn't give you the reward data, let's go down to the transaction data. So after I've read in the transaction data, I'm going to call DSR with the data set I just read in, which is cur.transaction. Then I want to run frequencies on all these variables: sponsor code, offer type, bonus, and data num. And so, whenever I get a data set, doesn't matter where I get it, I'll run this DSR, and it just saves me from having to type contents, means, freq, and print. And then I keep this file sitting around so that whenever I need to do something on it, so 6 months from now or 5 years from now, if I come back and want to do something with this data set, then I just open up my read.dat list and I know what the variables are, what the means are, and some of these variables that are kind of important to me. Okay, so that's a data sufficiency report. Let's talk about another one. I end up doing a lot of factor analyses, and one of the most common tasks that I have is I want to run a coefficient alpha and a factor analysis on a data set. So here's a little macro that I've written. I call it alpha. So alpha takes 3 arguments: the data set name, a set of variables, and a title. So the title gets displayed. I'm going to run proc core on the data set that I provided using the variables that are listed under X, and then we've got some options up there that give me coefficient alpha and so forth. Then I want to do the same, I want to use the same data set but run a proc factor on it. This time we're going to use a varimax rotation, and we're going to do it on the same variables. So when I'm doing some scale development work from a survey, I might end up calling this thing 30 times. So it's just something I always use. We go back to my my bin, $home.bin, you're going to see an fa.sass out here. And it has exactly that. It has another macro that I use for doing exploratory factor analysis. So that's FA.